1,200 German U-boats sitting on the bottom of a Norwegian fjord, engines corroded, hulls still sealed, and in some of them, the remains of the men who never made it out. This is not a legend. This is not speculation. This is Hjeltefjorden, a narrow slash of freezing black water northwest of Bergen, Norway. And what lies beneath its surface is one of the most extraordinary and most forgotten military graveyards on Earth. But to understand how more than 1,000 submarines ended up entombed in a Norwegian fjord, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a time when these same vessels were the most feared weapons on the planet. Back to when the Atlantic Ocean itself was a battlefield and Germany was winning. It is 1939. The Second World War has just begun. Adolf Hitler's navy, the Kriegsmarine, has a problem. Germany's surface fleet is outgunned by the British Royal Navy. Battleship for battleship, destroyer for destroyer, Britain holds the edge. So Germany makes a decision that will shape the war at sea for the next 6 years. They will go underwater. The U-boat, short for Unterseeboot, the German word for submarine, becomes the weapon of choice. Fast enough to intercept convoys, small enough to hide, deadly enough to change history. And in the early years of the war, they are devastatingly effective. By 1942, German U-boats are sinking Allied ships at a rate that terrifies even Winston Churchill. In 1 month alone, March 1943, they send 108 Allied ships to the bottom of the Atlantic. Over 500,000 tons of cargo, food, fuel, ammunition, gone. Churchill later writes that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril, not the Blitz, not the fall of France, the submarines. And at the heart of this underwater war is a place most people have never heard of, a place carved into the rock of occupied Norway, a fortress so massive, so impenetrable that it would outlast the war itself, and then some. To understand the fjords, you have to understand the geography. Norway's coastline is not a coastline in any ordinary sense. It is a shattered edge of the continent, fractured into thousands of inlets, channels, and passages by tens of thousands of years of glacial movement. The fjords run deep, in some places over 1,000 meters straight down. They are sheltered from the open ocean. They are cold enough to preserve almost anything. And in 1940, when Germany occupied Norway in a lightning campaign that lasted just 62 days, they instantly recognized what they had, a perfect hiding place for submarines. The Norwegian fjords gave the German Navy something they could not build anywhere else: natural concealment. A U-boat sitting in a Norwegian fjord was invisible from the air, shielded from British naval patrols, and positioned within striking distance of the critical Allied convoy routes across the North Atlantic. Within weeks of the occupation, the Kriegsmarine begins moving assets north. They requisition harbors, they commandeer shipyards, and then they begin building something that defies belief. They call it the Dora. Later, the world will know it simply as the Bergen U-boat bunker. Construction begins in 1941. The scale of it is almost impossible to comprehend. 20,000 workers, many of them forced laborers, prisoners of war, civilians dragged from their homes across occupied Europe, are put to work blasting, digging, and pouring concrete into the Bergen waterfront. The bunker that rises from this labor is not a building. It is a mountain made by human hands. The finished structure is 153 meters long. 15 meters of solid reinforced concrete sits above the waterline, covering 7 individual submarine pens. Each pen is wide enough to hold a U-boat with room to spare. The walls are so thick that Allied bombing raids, and there were many, barely scratched them. In one attack in October 1944, the RAF drops its heaviest bombs directly onto the bunker roof. The bombs detonate. The concrete absorbs the blast. The U-boats inside are untouched. Inside this bunker, submarines are repaired, rearmed, and resupplied. Crews rotate through on brutal schedules. A U-boat might return from a 2-month patrol in the North Atlantic, battered and fuel-starved, and be back in the water within days. The pace is relentless, the losses are staggering, and yet the patrols continue. Here is a number that puts the U-boat war in perspective. Germany builds 1,162 U-boats during the entire war. Of the roughly 40,000 men who serve in them, over 28,000 do not come home. That is a 70% casualty rate. In any other branch of any military, in any war, those numbers would be considered catastrophic. In the U-boat service, they are simply the cost of doing business.
But here's what nobody expected. Germany does not lose the Battle of the Atlantic slowly. It loses it suddenly. In May 1943, a single month that U-boat commanders would later call Black May, 41 German submarines are sunk. 41. In 30 days. The Allies have cracked the Enigma code. They have developed new sonar. They have deployed long-range aircraft equipped with radar that can find a U-boat running on the surface in the dead of night. Almost overnight, the hunter becomes the hunted. The U-boat commanders who survive Black May know something has changed. The odds, already brutal, have shifted. A patrol that once ended with a sinking record and a celebration now ends, if it ends at all, with the boat slinking back to Bergen, hull pocked with depth charge damage, crew hollow-eyed and shaking. The war beneath the Atlantic is over. Germany just hasn't admitted it yet. They keep sending submarines out. The patrols continue through 1944 into 1945. Fewer ships come back. The bunker at Bergen fills not with trophies, but with wounded men and damaged boats. And somewhere in the back offices of the Kriegsmarine High Command, a question no one wants to ask out loud begins to take shape. What happens to all of this when the war ends? Then, something remarkable happened. In the spring of 1945, it ends fast. By April, Allied forces are closing in on Germany from both east and west. Hitler kills himself on April 30th. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat campaign, the man who built the underwater wolf packs into the most feared naval force on Earth, becomes head of state for 7 days. On May 7th, 1945, Germany surrenders unconditionally. For the men in the U-boats, the end comes in a specific way. Each crew receives a radio signal, a final, historic order. The order is called Operation Regenbogen. Rainbow. It commands every U-boat commander to scuttle his vessel, flood the ballast tanks, open the seacocks, send the boat to the bottom rather than hand it to the Allies. Dönitz believes that a German submarine in Allied hands is a defeat worse than surrender. He would rather drown the entire fleet. Some commanders obey, some do not. Some are too far at sea to receive the signal clearly. Some are already surrendering to Allied vessels who are pulling alongside and ordering them to the surface at gunpoint. The result is chaos. Magnificent, historically significant chaos. 218 U-boats are scuttled by their own crews. Others surrender at ports across the Atlantic, at Loch Eriboll in Scotland, at Lissahalli in Northern Ireland. And an enormous number, the majority of the surviving fleet, sail themselves into the fjords of western Norway and wait. What happens next is one of the stranger bureaucratic moments of the Second World War. The Allies suddenly find themselves in possession of more submarines than they know what to do with. They take inventory. They inspect. They argue. Britain wants to study the technology. The Americans want to test the boats. The Soviets want their share under the terms of the peace agreement. Everyone has a claim. Nobody agrees on the numbers. And all the while, the submarines sit in the Norwegian fjords, engines idling, waiting for orders that keep not coming. The agreement they eventually reach is called Operation Deadlight. The Allied powers will divide a portion of the U-boats among themselves for study and testing. The rest, the vast majority, will be sunk, deliberately, taken out into the open Atlantic northwest of Ireland and destroyed. 116 submarines are scuttled in this operation between November 1945 and February 1946. They are towed out in batches, some bombed from the air, some torpedoed, some simply opened up and left to sink. It is a strange, muted funeral for the most feared naval weapon of the war. But here is the detail that changes everything. Not all of them make it to the planned scuttling grounds. Some are sunk in the wrong places. Some break free of their tow lines in storms and go down where they float. And an unknown number, estimates range widely, and the true figure remains disputed to this day, never leave the Norwegian fjords at all. They sink there. They corrode there. They become part of the seafloor. Hjeltefjorden lies about 25 kilometers northwest of Bergen. It is not a dramatic fjord by Norwegian standards. It does not have the towering walls of Fjord or the fame of Fjord. It is simply a deep, cold, dark body of water that happens to have been a staging point for the post-war disposal of the German submarine fleet. And, on its floor, confirmed by Norwegian researchers, documented in dive surveys catalogued in academic papers, there are U-boats. The exact count is one of those historical questions that produces fierce arguments among researchers. The figure of 1,200 that circulates in popular accounts almost certainly represents the total number of German submarines accounted for across all Norwegian waters and the wider Atlantic disposal operations, not all sitting neatly in one fjord. But what is not disputed is this: dozens of U-boats are confirmed to rest in Norwegian fjords, some in shallow water, some in depths that make them effectively inaccessible without specialist equipment. Some so intact that their deck guns are still in place. Some so corroded that they are barely recognizable as the vessels they once were. Norwegian divers have been exploring these wrecks for decades. What they find is extraordinary. The boats are largely intact. Seawater is cold enough in these fjords to slow corrosion dramatically. Visibility on a clear day at the right depth is good enough to see the full length of a vessel. Divers report swimming alongside the conning towers, peering through hatches into flooded interiors, finding personal effects, boots, logbooks, tools, still sitting where they were left in 1945. One diver describes the experience as swimming through a museum that nobody built, everything arranged exactly as it was, everything simply waiting. But here is where the story takes a darker turn. Because these are not empty shells. Many of these U-boats still contain the remains of their crews. When a submarine sinks, whether by enemy action, by accident, or by deliberate scuttling, the men inside rarely have time to escape. The hatches seal under pressure. The compartments flood in seconds. In some documented cases, U-boats were found on the seafloor with their hatches still dogged shut from the inside, sealed by the crew themselves in the final moments, for reasons we can only speculate about. The Norwegian Directorate of Cultural Heritage has designated many of these wrecks as war graves under Norwegian law. They cannot be disturbed. They cannot be salvaged. They must be left as they are. This creates a strange tension in the waters of Hjeltefjorden and the other Norwegian fjords where U-boats lie. They are dive sites, recreational divers, technical divers, researchers. People visit them regularly, carefully, respectfully. They photograph, they document, they do not touch. And beneath them, the men of the Kriegsmarine, men who were 20 years old, 25 years old, men who had been at sea for months, men who were almost certainly terrified in their final moments, lie where they fell. The U-boats themselves present a practical problem that nobody in 1945 anticipated and that nobody today quite knows how to solve. They are not simply historical artifacts. They are environmental time bombs. A typical Type 7 U-boat, the most common model, the workhouse of the German submarine fleet, carries hundreds of liters of diesel fuel, lubricating oil and battery acid. It carries ammunition. It carries compressed gases. All of it sealed inside a corroding metal hull under increasing pressure as the metal weakens year by year. Norwegian environmental authorities have been monitoring several of the known wrecks for signs of leakage. Some are already showing it, a slow seep of oil rising to the surface in the cold water of the fjord. Not yet catastrophic, not yet anything more than a dark shimmer on the water, but the hulls are not getting stronger. The question of what to do about them has no clean answer. Raising them is technically possible, but extraordinarily expensive, and it would disturb war graves. Leaving them risks an eventual environmental disaster as the hulls finally give way. Sealing them with some kind of external coating has been discussed, but never executed at scale. For now, the Norwegian government monitors, documents, waits, and in the meantime the U-boats lie in the dark. Consider for a moment what it actually means that these things are down there. These are not ancient artifacts from a civilization we struggle to imagine. The men who built these boats, who sailed them, who died in them. Some of their children are still alive. Some of their grandchildren are in their 30s. and 40s. The war that put these submarines on the bottom of Norwegian fjords ended less than 80 years ago. In historical terms, that is nothing. In human terms, it is everything. The U-boat war was, by any measure, a catastrophe for everyone involved. The Allied merchant sailors who were killed, roughly 36,000 of them, died in some of the most horrible circumstances imaginable. Torpedoed in the North Atlantic in water so cold that survival was measured in minutes, burned alive when tankers carrying aviation fuel were hit, drowned when ships went down too fast for lifeboats to be launched. The human cost of the submarine campaign was staggering on both sides. And yet, the U-boat men were not monsters. They were largely young, largely patriotic, largely terrified. Grand Admiral Dönitz, who commanded them, and whom many of them revered, was convicted of war crimes at Nuremberg, partly for his submarine campaign, but sentenced to only 10 years in prison, in part because American Admiral Chester Nimitz testified that the US Navy had conducted similar unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. The moral geometry of the U-boat war has never been simple. What the fjords preserve, then, is not just metal and machinery. They preserve a moral complexity that the surface of historical memory tends to flatten. Down in the dark, in the cold water, the war does not resolve into heroes and villains. It resolves into young men who did not come home, and the boats that carried them, and the question of what we owe to both. The Bergen U-boat bunker, the Dora, is still standing. Of course it is. You cannot knock down 15 meters of reinforced concrete without spending more money than anyone has been willing to spend. Today, it serves as a museum, an events venue, and a working part of the Bergen harbour. Tourists walk through the submarine pens where mechanics once worked around the clock. Children pose for photographs in front of the enormous blast doors. The scale of it is still breathtaking. That is the thing about structures built for permanence by people who expected to use them forever. They outlast the purposes for which they were built. Efforts to formally document all of the U-boat wrecks in Norwegian waters continue. Norwegian maritime archaeologists, working with German naval historians and international researchers, have been building a comprehensive database of known sites. Each wreck is catalogued: depth, condition, estimated type, known crew complement. Each one is assessed for environmental risk. Each one is treated under Norwegian law with the dignity owed to a war grave. It is slow work. The fjords are cold and dark and deep, and the wrecks are scattered across hundreds of square kilometers of water. Some will never be definitively identified. Some sit in depths that put them beyond the reach of recreational diving equipment and require specialist, remotely operated vehicles to even photograph. The work of reckoning with what the Second World War left behind on the floor of the Norwegian fjords will take generations. But it is being done carefully, methodically, respectfully. Because the alternative, to forget, to let the fjords simply keep their secrets, is not something that the descendants of the men who sailed in these boats or the descendants of the men who were killed by them are prepared to accept. And so they dive, they photograph, they catalogue, they leave the hatches sealed. And in the fjords of western Norway, in water that is never warm and never fully light, 1,200 German submarines, or something very close to that number. The debate continues, and perhaps that is fitting. Wait in the dark. Engines corroded, hulls still sealed. The war over for 80 years, still waiting for orders that will never come.